Dear President, Madam Lily, other dignitaries of the Theosophical Society, friends, brothers, and sisters. For the today's public lecture by the International President, I was asked to give a short introduction, so here it is. Although most of you already, most of it, but it's never, it won't hurt to hear it again, I suppose. Mr. Tim Boyd has been serving as International President of the Theosophical Society, ADIAR, since April 2014. He was born in New York City and lived there for 17 years, until he left to attend Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. From there, he moved to the University of Chicago, where he was an honors graduate with the Bachelor of Arts degree in Public Affairs. He joined the Theosophical Society in America in 1974, and together with Bill Lawrence, a TS member and mentor, and others, he founded a Theosophical spiritual community in Chicago's inner city. The group held classes on the ageless wisdom, meditation, and healing. In 2007, he became president of the Theosophical Order of Service, TOS, USA, and in 2011, he was elected president of the TS in America. Tim's involvement with the Theosophical Order of Service and the Chushul orphanage in Tibet led to an audience with the Dalai Lama, which resulted in the TS in America sponsoring his visit to Chicago, that is the Dalai Lama's visit to Chicago, in July of 2011. A two-day event attended by 10,000 people. Tim was elected as International President of the Theosophical Society in ADIAR in 2014 and to a second 7-year term in 2021. So I would say no more, your presidency.
I'd like to thank the Venerable Olande for the introduction, mainly for his presence up here with me on the stage. And I'd also like to thank all of you for taking the time to come to this closing event of what has been an exceptional convention, the 149th. So at this point, I have the privilege, I guess, to try and put a ribbon on what has already been gifted to us over the period of these last few days. It's my hope that during the time that I'm speaking with you, that you will not be hearing anything new, which is to say nothing that you do not already know. I very often think that the purpose of these get-togethers and of these talks is to remind us, to help us to remember things that perhaps are a little bit hidden, perhaps a little forgotten. Not that we don't know, but sometimes it's good to hear it come out and be said by another. Today I wanted to talk about, the topic was to be spirituality and the practical world. And I think, for all intents and purposes, I'll stick to that. If we're going to be talking probably it's often good to establish, a common vocabulary, we could say. I think very often we talk and we say things and we use words assuming that they mean the same thing to all of us. They're common words. Spirituality is not something that's unknown to us. The world is not something that is unknown to us, but probably it doesn't hurt if we give it a little bit more fine definition. So for me, if we're going to be talking about spirit, necessarily spirituality applies to that, but some questions might be well to ask ourselves and perhaps attempt an answer. If we're talking about spirit, if we're framing it in words, what is it? What is spirit? It's a word we use frequently, and we use it with certain meanings in our minds, but can we really say what it is? When we look to the theosophical teachings, one of the things that comes across is that spirit is a very big word. In H.P.B's writings, when she spoke about the absolute, it's something that when we think of the absolute, often we tie this kind of spirit concept to it. But the absolute, from her point of view, is something that has no possible description. It has no words that can contain it, no words that can define it. It's nameless. It is not active, neither is it inactive. It's not being. I think it is expressed more as beingness, which is the potential for that state of being which comes out of it. But the absolute is not technically what we're talking about when we speak about spirit. Spirit and matter both are linked aspects of the absolute. And so when we talk about spirit, there's only really so much that we can say. There's not a lot that we know. We think that we know a lot. Spirit and matter are, linked together. But if we really go into it, what do we know about either one? Start with matter, the material world. It is, for probably the last 400 years, since the type of science that has become predominant in the world today had its beginnings, we have studied the material world meticulously. Every process, every phenomenon that could be pointed to, that could be named, has been studied, has been tested, has been experimented with, and theories and explanations and descriptions abound. So much so that in the face of the voice of science, everyone tends to quiet down. That's the authority when it comes to all things. But probably as many, if not most of you know, science today has some issues that it is facing. And it's bold enough to face them. But for instance, this material realm that we feel we know better than all others, what has been discovered, and it's not a recent discovery, is that everything that we know about matter and the material universe probably amounts to approximately 4% of all that is there. There has become this term that has been developed, which is dark matter and dark energy. Just the simple idea behind that is that when scientists look at the way that galaxies behave, it's apparent that they behave in a way where there has to be more matter than is visible in order for these galaxies to be the force of gravity to hold them together in the ways that it does. There has to be. But for whatever reason, that matter cannot be seen, cannot be tested, cannot be identified, but mathematically, it has to be there. So what do you do with that? When you realize that the bulk of what is described as the real world is completely invisible and unknown. I very much like the solution that they came up with. Also, when they look at the way that the universe is expanding, again, it's something that, given the laws that we are familiar with and that we're trained on in school, it can't be happening this way with the energy and with the matter that is known to be in existence. And so what they have found is that the rate of expansion of the universe can only be justified if, in fact, there is energy that is being applied to defy our normal concepts about gravitation. And so they call that dark energy. And so between dark energy and dark matter, 96% of all that there is in this universe, of all that it is that we see, all that we smell, all that we hear, all that we know, is, their word is dark. You and I in conversation would probably use the word is unknown. And so, as I say, I like the solutions because one of the ways that it has been done is, in order to retain the existing paradigm about what reality is, they are able to calculate the percentage of energy and matter required for this to happen. So you have a hard and fast number about 96% of it is dark. Basically, 96% of our reality is unknown. That's just on the matter side. So spirit, the same sort of thing applies. We'll talk a little bit about what it is we do know, what we can know, but the limits of it, the extent of it, is not something that at our stage of unfoldment is in any way knowable. So what we end up doing is dealing with what it is we do know and trying to extend from that, use that as a platform for our growing understanding. So spirit, we may not be able to put our finger on what that is, but spirituality, well, that's another thing. Annie Besant gave a very concise definition of spirituality. She said that spirituality is the realization of unity. It is the seeing of oneness in all things. That's something that we can work with. That basically spirituality is an approach to spirit that presents us with a sense of unity, of oneness. And it works in a couple of different ways. When we talk about spirituality, it's something that this seeing of the oneness in all things places certain demands on someone who sees in that manner. All of us hope and we strive, and from time to time, we realize this sort of seeing. And it's something that unfolds basically in two ways. It's something that it unfolds unconsciously, and HPB's description of this state of unfoldment is that it unfolds due to what's described as natural impulse. Basically, we're pushed by nature, we're impelled, We're blown here and there, and ultimately, if we bounce around enough, they call it the school of hard knocks in the United States. If you have enough hard knocks, you open your eyes and you learn. You could call it cultivation of consciousness through crisis. And one of the things that does seem to have some merit is the idea that we as a human family, while there are other ways of learning, that very often we create the crises for ourselves that advance us in our understanding. There's a story in the Buddhist tradition that talks about two children in a house that's on fire. They're playing a game. The house is burning down around them, but they are so fixated on the game that they're playing that surely they will be carried out by the flame. It will engulf them. In that particular story, they're coaxed out of the house by an enlightened being showing them two playthings that attract their attention. But when I think about the conditions that we are facing in the world, during the time that our governor was here with us speaking, he made a point of it to enumerate a lot of the things that we know are facing us as a human family. The fires that are active in the house. As members of this body, as people of consciousness, we may look at it in a different way. But when you really look at it in terms of what's happening in the world today, we have all of the things with the climate change. We have fires burning where there never were. We have deserts growing. You know the list. And yet and still, when you look at what might be the response as a humanity, at this point, it's something that might be described as we're pouring more fuel on the flame and looking for some sort of technological solutions to the fires that we are feeding. That's one way that we learn. That's one way that we become aware of spirit, through the negative approach, the opposite approach. And then also we can become aware of it consciously. That consciously we can create the conditions that move us toward a deeper understanding. HPB's words, it's accomplished through self-induced and self-devised efforts. And this is what moves us toward this recognition of oneness. The idea that we commit to a path, that we commit to a practice, and that that's something that has its effects. In the world of theosophical thinking, there's a lot of things that we take for granted as true. In many ways, because they are true. I mean, such a thing as consciousness and the primacy of consciousness is something that we take as a given. That's not something that is the same for the scientific community. In fact, in the community of science, there is this thing that is described as the hard problem. That hard problem is consciousness. It is not explainable in the terms of science, because how do you explain? They can point to the synapses in the brain that register pain. They can point to the synapses that register pleasure. They can point to the chemical and electrical reactions and show what's happening. But the idea that we feel pain, the idea that we feel joy, the idea that it is possible to connect with others in ways that are not biological, not chemical, that consciousness has its involvement is undeniable. I mean, obviously it takes consciousness to even analyze the problem, but it can't be measured. It can't be quantified. And that's what is spoken of as the hard problem. And I think in many ways, spirit is similar. I mean, spirit is similar in that it is something that for the scientist, for those who approach spirit from the point of view of a spiritual scientist, it's something that also, it's not measurable, but we are aware of it. And we experience it. And we know the reality of its existence. But it's this whole idea, many of the religions of the world, all of them in fact, any spiritual tradition really is one that invites us to a scientific approach to our own unfoldment. The idea that we are here to experiment, and that the religions of the world, the great teachers of the world, provided us with formulas, with experiments, with theories about the inner life that, as with anything that's scientific, is testable, is repeatable. You take something like the voice of the silence. There's this little phrase that says, self-knowledge is of loving acts the child. It's beautiful, it's poetic, but it's also something that lends itself to experimentation. These great truths are spoken, not just for you to sit and nod your head and say yes, but for your own experimentation with which you either find that it's true or it's not. And so how do you approach an experiment related to self-knowledge is of loving acts the child? I mean, for me, what is it that is meant by loving acts? And if those can be identified, and if I can incorporate that in my behavior, in the laboratory of my own consciousness, loving acts persisted in for a sufficient amount of time, does it in fact lead to this thing of self-knowledge? That's what they ask us to test. All of these different aphorisms and phrases that we quote from the Bible, from the Quran, from the Bhagavad Gita, from the Dhammapada. Buddha says that all that we are is the result of what we have thought. Is that true? Is that testable? He says that if you think an evil thought, then you experience pain. The way it's described in the Dhammapada is that pain follows you like the wheel follows the oxen that pulls the cart. It's beautiful. There's all these poetic scientific formula. If you act with a pure thought, then happiness follows you like a never-departing shadow. It's beautiful. But it's also intended for us, for our experimentation, to determine from our own experience whether or not these things are true. That's the beauty of it. So when it comes to spirit, even though we can't put our finger on it, even though we can't grab it, we do experience it. I can remember many years ago, I was in France, and I was invited to have lunch. And it turns out that the person's house where I was having lunch was, for whatever reason, it was situated right in the middle of acres and acres of sunflowers. They grew the sunflowers for the seeds and for the oil. And so sat down in the afternoon on a very nice sunny day. And one of the things that is very typically French is that meals go on a long time. It's like you sit down, and I was talking today with one of our members from France. They said when you're sitting for lunch in France, the conversation always turns to, okay, what are we going to do next for dinner? Because they run together. Good conversation, course after course of different foods, and it's wonderful. But during that time, the thing that really impressed me was not the food. I don't remember the conversation. But what impressed me was this, that as I sat there, periodically I'd look out the window. And I have seen it before, where a sunflower tracks the sun as it moves across the sky. But to see it where you have acres, where as far as you can see is sunflowers, and all of them following the pathway of the sun, was something that impressed me very deeply. And to me, it's a model, in a way, of our experience, our approach to spirit. We know it's there. We lean toward it wherever we find it. I remember many years ago, I was fortunate enough to be somewhere where the Dalai Lama was talking to a group of people, and it was right around the time of the Tiananmen Square occurring in China. And he was talking about this fact, what was to him a fact. This was a country where for more than 2 generations, any sort of expression of spirituality or religion had been suppressed. It wasn't something that was permitted, it wasn't something that was allowed. And so it was something that the assumption was that it would die, it would wither. With this Tiananmen Square uprising, what he witnessed was this outflowing of compassionate activity toward its nation, towards its people. People were willing to stand in front of tanks in order to have this expression of a potential of freedom for themselves and for others. Compassion, it seems, is something that is hardwired in all of us as human beings. And if you think about it, family structures, societal structures, wherever we look, they are structured really with the intent that we serve and we protect the weakest among us. With a family, everything is sacrificed for the child. There's nothing that's held back in a family that is deemed to be healthy, that is deemed to be appropriately attentive to parenthood. The weakest among us is the one that attracts our deepest attention. The weak, the elderly, the sick, the poor, the hungry, these are the ones where in healthy societies, there are structures that are built in order to serve the weakest among us. And when we find that we are in a situation, either in a nation or in a family or in a world, where that becomes something that is ignored, something that is not attended to, we feel unease. Very often it's the cause of uprisings throughout history where certain populations have been abused. And that needs to be corrected. I think in many ways in the world today there is a sense of unease, that there are things that we can point to that require correction and that require the reestablishment of what are inner, natural, native values and practices that are spiritually oriented. The whole idea of compassion, it's described in many ways. In Buddhist practice, compassion is thought of as the desire to relieve the suffering of other sentient beings. But I think it's more than that. I mean, probably some of you have heard me say this before, that if you look at what is happening when we find ourselves engaged in some compassionate activity, for everyone, there is this natural sort of sense of the importance of me. In many ways, it all begins here, it flows from here, and a lot of times we don't focus beyond that. But again, let someone become a parent, let someone become a spouse, and that circle of concern extends. And it extends to one. It extends to two, where you have patriots, great people willing to sacrifice their own lives for their country. It extends to a nation. You have people like Mahatma Gandhi, who in India, Mahatma Gandhi was a lawyer. And, in the United States and other places, sometimes lawyers don't have the best reputation. But he started as a lawyer. And then he traveled to South Africa, and he became involved in the movement there. Might have been described as a civil rights movement. He traveled from that, his awareness extended. First, it was in South Africa, where he was looking to alleviate the suffering of my people, the people that were there, the oppressed Indian population, oppressed by the same sort of divided apartheid system that was in place at the time. And those sentiments expanded. Ultimately, it expanded to the point where he came back to India. He had to learn about India. He had been gone for so long. But he came here, and those sentiments expanded again to embrace a larger people. And then when you think about the ones that we point to as really the great ones, the messiahs, the avatars, those sort of people, their compassion is something that is absolutely without limits. Nationhood, gender, none of these things. Religion, they're not ignored. To that consciousness, they're unreal. And so this process of compassion speaks to this same thing that Besant was talking about, spirituality. It is the seeing of the oneness of all things. It is the expansion of limits that we accepted for ourselves to embrace all people, when compassion is extreme, when it reaches its extremes of that sort. So that's what goes on with that. But how do we know? What is our experience of compassion? Of spirit. And I think we know it most keenly from what we might even call the symptoms of spirituality. The signs that we see. When we talk about peace, when we talk about joy, happiness, when we talk about or experience healing. These are the things that to us are signposts of something much deeper. And those are the things that we lean toward. So, a question we might ask, if any of this that I'm saying is true, if it has merit, then why is it that in a general sense, we tend to remain so unaware of its presence, of its activity? Why? And that's a question that I think has been a motivation throughout the ages for all of the avatars, the messiahs, the prophets, the saints, the seers, the messengers who have come to try to do something to heal us from our ongoing blindness to who we really are. to what we even recognize as our deepest potential. They come here and they attempt to do that. And whether you're talking about Jesus, Buddha, J. Krishnamurti, Muhammad, Shankara, I mean, the list is long of those people who have come and have tried. And, you could say, at least it wouldn't be unfair to ask the question, that if, in fact, they were here to open our eyes, what was the effect of their coming? And, you could look at it. Before the Buddha came, before he lived, what was the condition of humanity? After he came, after he gave his messages, after he lived his life, then what was the condition of humanity? Certainly there were many people who experienced enlightenments, who experienced the descent of this deep sense of compassion. But did wars stop? Was starvation ended? Was the imbalance of economic differences, was that altered? To some people, the thought would be, well, that would be some sort of demonstration that somehow they failed. They tried, but they failed. I wouldn't agree with that. I would go more with the idea that's expressed in the Mahachohan's letter. And it's something that we all witness as a fact, that no prophet, no saint, no seer has ever achieved full success during their lifetime. That they planted seeds, that they started movements that would add to the possibility for enlightenment and unfoldment, but the ultimate success is something that is a very long-range project. But one of the things that does occur is that they attract the attention of people like us, normal people, but people to whom this idea that there is such a thing as spirit has some reality. People who have some experience, even if momentary, of being elevated, of having spiritual moments that speak to the possibility for that to be the inheritance of humanity. And for many people, that's something that's worth dedicating a life. Even though, you know that by the time you're gone, little will have changed, but much will have changed. The other day, I was talking with a group of people, and the point was made that, what are we going to be able to do in a lifetime? And perhaps, much like others that have come before, the example that I gave is if I'm going to be walking to the back of this stadium, back of this hall, if I start walking in that direction, if when I'm standing here, I change my course by an inch, by the time I get to the back of the hall here, instead of reaching that point, I'll be someplace way over here. That our capacity to influence ourselves and others, we can't ever forget that that's a power, and that we are playing in a long range. We are part of a long range plan of action, a long range, you could say game, except game probably doesn't do it justice. So this is this process that we make an effort to awaken. We make an effort to connect with spirit in order that in some way this world in which we live, this practical world, can be influenced. There are a couple of ways. There's something that most of us think of, and it's described in various ways, but when we think about a spiritual path, for instance, that there is a direction, that we are walking in. Krishnamurti talked about truth being a pathless land. But the idea that on our way to truth, we do follow a path. And according to Blavatsky, it's a path that is steep and thorny, that leads to this experience of truth. And it takes place in 3 distinct phases, according to me. It seems that there is this idea that at some point, while once we were asleep, at a certain point, we wake up. You know, the story, the Bible story about the prodigal son is the example. A son who leaves the house of his father, who has everything, who gives everything to him, the house of universal consciousness, and goes out on his own, incarnates, ultimately incarnates in a distant land, the land that we're inhabiting, the land of matter, living in a material body, and finds himself completely cut off, forgotten about his divine heritage. But a point comes where that person awakens. And in terms of this spiritual life and in terms of this theosophical practice, that's the all-important moment for us, the point where we wake up and remember that there are other possibilities, much greater than the ones we are embracing at the moment. And that sets something into motion. Once there is this awakening, then the bulk of the journey, you reach home and you meet the father, you hug, the son meets the father, hugs him, is happy to have him home. But along the way is the main part of this journey, where a process of purification, that we try to purify, try to change those things that have been impediments, that have blocked us along the way. Before we even get to that, part of the question that we have to ask ourselves is why? If all of these things are true, if we have this potential, why is it that we are so resistant to truth? Why is it that time and time again people can come and live their lives and die trying to communicate to us about what is truth and how we can get there and how we can experience? What inside of us makes us so resistant? Because if we can see that, then we can free ourselves. The poet T.S. Eliot, he was a Nobel laureate poet some years ago. In one of his poems, he makes the point that we are distracted from distraction by distraction. I love that. We are distracted. And in order to continue our distraction, we distract ourselves from distraction by further distraction. And I think all of you who own cell phones can point to the reality of that. People like J. Krishnamurti came and spent, 60 years of his life trying to make a point. Trying to point to this cause of this tendency toward distraction. And he would use such things as the conditioned mind, that we are continually being conditioned by our own thoughts, by the thoughts of others, that there is this conditioning, these layers and layers of conditioning that we live through that block us from any experience. We are so insulated from reality by all of this conditioning. The idea that there is memory, the overwhelming importance of what we remember, and how we try to live out of these memories that have happened before that control the way we behave now. I have a good friend who there's an expression by Confucius that he loves to quote. And Confucius apparently said, my tailor. I consider my tailor, the one who sews his clothes, to be the wisest man I know, because every time that I see him, he measures me anew. I mean, it's clever, it's funny, but the point of it is, do we do that? You know, yesterday, you hurt my feelings. Today, you're that person who hurt my feelings. And I don't want to have anything to do with you. You know, years ago, you spoke badly about my family. And so, you know, you are persona non grata in my house. You know it because we all have done it. So there is this quality that remains unseen. You know, the fact of it is that seeing is healing. You know, there are no drugs required to heal. There's no drugs required to relieve ourselves from a certain sort of blindness. Seeing. But in this process of purification, you know, that's where it becomes very, very important to be able to assess ourselves. And again, we can do it, as I said, consciously, or it can occur unconsciously. They say there's something called the first law of wholes. And I don't mean holistic. I mean a hole, like a hole in the wall or a hole in the ground. The first law of wholes is that if you ever find yourself in a hole, the first law is stop digging. Don't make it deeper. You know, this is a spiritual law, you could even say. Don't make it deeper. Do no harm is what the Buddha said. First thing. Do no harm, that stops the digging. Do good. That starts the process of climbing out. Purify your minds. That's the one that gets you up to the edge and gets you functional back in the world again. You know, these are the things that are involved in this process of purification on the long road of return to a state of oneness, to the realization of oneness that Annie Besant spoke about. This is a process that's described. And ultimately, you know, there's awakening, there's purification, and then there is realization. You know, that moment when, in fact, in the example of the prodigal son, where he steps once again into the land of his father, and his father greets him and gives him all good things. That sort of thing is the moment of realization. The moment when we realize that, in fact, the grace and the goodness of this universe within which we live, move, and have our being is continuously present. And that we find ourselves present for the first time. The first time because this time we're actually aware of it. No different than what it is right now sitting in these seats. But this time, we're aware. And that changes everything, the awareness. So really what I'd like to do, I think we're very familiar with all of these ideas, all of these principles, when it's applied to our own unfoldment. I think these are things that we try to cultivate, ability to see and ability to act. We try to be aware of the obstacles that we have created and try to do something to alleviate them. I was very much impressed when our governor from Tamil Nadu spoke the other night, with some of the things that he said especially. And part of the idea that was expressed by him was about the power of collective action. You know, it's easy and it's necessary that we focus on our unfoldment, because if we are not in a state of usability, then, you know, we don't serve much of a purpose. So, but then what? You know, along the way, do we wait until we are enlightened before we try to do something that is healing to the world and to each other? And so, you know, that's something that is it's not something that's absent from my thinking, and it's not something that is absent from the way it is that we have tried to approach the things that we do here at Adyar. And so to me, an example of a possibility is no farther away than this place. Annie Besant described this as the master's home. And it's not idle words. I think everybody who has been here has at some time felt something more exalted than just beautiful nature and camaraderie among those of us who are here. I think most people have had some sort of experience, whether it's explicable to us or not, we feel. But this has been described as the home of the master. And historically, particularly coming from Besant's point of view, it's something that had been verified. That during her time here and during the time of Olcott and the time of HPB, the presence of the masters of the wisdom was not infrequent at all. And so she's emphasized that. So in this place, part of the experience of being here and working with this, if it doesn't change you, then it's because you're not paying attention. And I think with everybody who connects here in a deep way, it has a changing effect. And what I'd like to describe is this. In many ways, I look at it as a virtuous cycle. I mean, we all have heard the term a vicious cycle, where the guy comes home angry from work, he kicks the cat runs through the house, knocks over the fire lamp, the house burns down, he gets angrier. Vicious cycle. But there is, in fact, this thing that can be described as a virtuous cycle, where one thing feeds the growth and the expansion, the magnification of another. And that's what I see here. And so even in terms of this awakening, purification, realization model, I find that here, and we're talking really about my time, the experience that I have witnessed. And arriving here at Adyar, for me, was a moment of awakening. And in many ways, it was an awakening almost like you wake up in the morning, that somehow you open your eyes. A little while before that, you were in some sort of dream or doing something, but now you open your eyes and you realize you're in this physical body, and that now it's time, it has to get out of bed and start doing whatever it is that it does. I found myself here. And the physical body of this place was in decline. Structures. And, one of the things that any of us who should recognize, I think I have enough gray hair to be able to speak to this, that as time goes on, it seems that there is this process of potential decay and decline, which if you don't do something to alter or interrupt that process, it takes over. And so you find yourself with that. And one of the main signals of that is the slowing down of your energies. And so here, for a period, it was like awakening and looking around and then trying to figure what it is that is a next step. And the obvious thing, when we talk about this awakening and then purification, the most obvious thing that you could point to, and something that we could actually do something with, was the structures. We have 100 and some odd buildings on this land, and every one of them was in need. Those are obvious things. And those are things that we could approach. But we started with that, the most obvious. And that posed certain difficulties. But as we were able to get that moving, along with it came certain inner changes, you could say. These are outer things that you're doing, but they have inner effects. And so along with it came a recognition of the beauty that had been hidden. You know, our goal in any of this kind of purification activity is not to give life or to bring life. Life is there in whatever it is, whether it's with a person or whether it's with a building. It is alive. The goal is to reveal it, to remove that which obscures it from view. I think about our art conservation. I'm almost describing the art conservation process, meticulously removing that which hides the beauty. And then when it's fully seen, the effect on us, those of us who have had the privilege of working here at Adyar, was that there was a certain sense of appreciation, recognition of beauty, empowerment, that if we can do this, we can do other things as well. And that had its effect. Out of that, we started to discover people who could further this process. And these people generally were people who were right here all the time. But conditions had to be created in order to make it possible for them to give what was within them. Oftentimes, they didn't even know how much they had within them. But out of that, people were discovered in this matter. Out of that, the people who became active found that within themselves, with these new opportunities that were open to them, that their own sense of vision expanded. Their potentials that they might not have even known about for management, for efficiency, for seeing a bigger picture, for collaborative work, which has been the emphasis of all of this. You know, no one can do anything with a place like Adyar. No one can do anything by themselves. And so the whole point has been to develop a collaborative point of view, bit by bit by bit. That collaborative point of view continues to grow. As we find our ways to serve, then wider avenues of service have opened themselves up. You know, now we look around and it's like, you know, whereas before we were struggling to have the 4 primary holidays of the Theosophical Society celebrated and attended, now we have a library that is on the cutting edge of the 21st century. I should tell you, when I first came here, I said it as a joke, but I also said it seriously, that if during my time here as serving as president, I could bring the Theosophical Society here in Adyar into the 20th century, I would be very happy. We're talking about all of this happened already in the 21st century. So if we could get to the 20th century, I would be happy. Now, I find that here at Adyar, we're pushing to be on the cusp of the 22nd century. We're going to leave all of you all behind. Because this is the way that things are now developing, that inner potentials arise as conditions are created. Our whole job is not to make anything happen. It's to create an environment that removes obstacles. You know, there's that expression in the Idol of the White Lotus, the soul of man and woman is immortal, and its future is the future of a thing whose growth and splendor has no limit. So our role is to remove obstacles that limit. And with that, you also find that there is this arising sense of guidance in all that we do. It's something that you notice, you become aware of. And it almost gets to the point that you expect it. How and when, you may not know, but you know it will. And over time after time, when certain crises have arisen, always there was the appearance of something or someone to change it. A lot of talk goes on in the theosophical circles about the masters, and we should. There was a time when a lot of the expression got to be just too much. A letter was written, one of the Mahatma letters was written to Annie Besant saying that this whole outcry about the master has to be stopped because it was distracting and it was inaccurate and people were tending toward glamour. Everyone was contacting the master to aid them and to uplift them and to initiate them. It was what he was speaking against. And so for the longest time, that kind of conversation in many quarters was suppressed. Not that the masters were suppressed, but from time to time, I do, as I travel, I get questions about the masters. One of those questions, where are they? How long has it been since anyone got a letter? We had a good friend in the United States, Nancy, and all of us from the US, Robert Bonnell. In addition to being a very prominent theosophist, he was a stand-up comic. And every year during convention, he would do a stand-up comedy routine. And one of his lines was, I didn't get a letter. Talking about, I did all this good, but where? I didn't get a letter. So I have even been asked if I have ever received a letter from the Mahatmas. And I wouldn't answer it in this way because in today's technological world, it would be certain to be taken out of context. But here we go. If I were to be asked and to answer truthfully, but perhaps not in the sense that the question is intended, have you ever received a letter from the master? My answer would be many. But none of them were written on paper. So it's not something that can go into an archives. But letters from the master, particularly in my experience here at Adyar, have been many. But it seems as if these letters have been written on the hearts and in the character of many of the people who have come here to help to make this work that we are attempting to grow. That's a letter from the masters, received, thankfully. And quite honestly, we find ourselves walking around and sharing this campus with many of those letters. I know them, they have names. And so this is something that becomes, in many ways, the norm. The masters, we want to call on them, we want their help, we want their assistance in our personal issues, but in order to use their energies effectively, they need to have groups, bodies that have the potential to reach people more widely with their service. With the Theosophical Society, that was its intent from the beginning. And that's its intent at this point, that level of connection. I have to say, this is something just about me. By nature, I think I wouldn't be wrong in describing myself as an optimist. I believe in bright things. And my experience tells me that I'm not wrong. Actually, you could make the argument that the optimist is always right. I would make that argument, certainly. But the optimist is always right, maybe not in the short term, but in the long term, Yeah, there is this expression that the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice, but it also bends toward harmony. It bends toward peace. It bends toward enlightenment. It bends toward compassion. That's the arc of this universe. Where we find ourselves in that arc at any given moment that's the conditions we have to contend with. But optimistically speaking, that's the future that awaits us. And for each of us, if we're lucky, the fact is that all of us are here for a very brief time. We get a bunch of chances at it, but it's brief. And it would make sense for us to try as early as possible to think in terms of the most effective ways to utilize this time. You put that thought into it, and then you find yourself moving along that line. I could feel that I might be able to delay doing good for a little bit longer because I come from a family of people who live a long time. 100 years old isn't uncommon in my family. So I can wait to be kind. But no, we have a brief time. And during that brief time, as has happened with us, we find ourselves sitting in a situation, we find ourselves receiving the wisdom of the ages that others lived and died to make available to us. I have no doubt that it's a likelihood, given the patterns of human behavior that seem so intractable at the moment, that there will be dark times, there always have been, but that all of us have the capacity to go through those and to bring others through whole, unfragmented. Once we learn to work together, not just in isolation. This whole idea of collective responsibility, when you have a group such as the Theosophical Society that adheres to certain principles, especially when things get a little bit rocky, that's when those things need to come to the fore. There was a poet, I think it was William Blake, who made the statement that all that is now real was once imagined. Everything that's real now is a product of some group imagination, some individual imagination, but it's the product of what our capacity to imagine and to act on behalf of that imagination. I believe in that. And what I would ask is that as a body, that we lend ourselves toward that kind of dreaming, that in some way we find the capacity to dream a world together, to call that world into being, because it's waiting just on the other side of this imagining process. And again, I say that because time after time here, I've seen it. When I look at what we're doing here now, you have all of these things that came out of nowhere. An arts conservation project, Adyar eco-development, the library growing in the ways that it is. It's just one thing after another that was not here, that is flourishing, and that is painting the way for others and for other possibilities. So I think in closing the convention, I want to thank you, as always, not just for your attention, but for the energies that you have brought to bear over these 4 days. It's been a good time, as it always is. I always seem to notice when we start off, there's this sense of things not yet coming together. It comes, and as it ends, at least for me, I find myself I will be sitting down with a sense of a renewed hope and a renewed sense of wholeness because of what we've done together. So as always, thank you all. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Well, Tim, thank you for that very, very informative and elevating and inspiring talk for everyone. Something to think about, to do, and therefore it will have its ripple effects, I'm pretty sure. And thanks once again for this beautiful talk, which everybody, I suppose, has liked similarly. And wish everyone, after this convention, that you may go your own ways in peace and happiness.